Good morning, everyone. Welcome to those of you that have joined us very promptly and very early. Welcome to Lumenii's first webinar for 2023. We're very excited to be presenting this and presenting a very illustrious panel to you. I will introduce the panel a little bit later on, but I think let's just give some of our delegates and attendees a chance to sign on. We've had a phenomenal response to the invitations we sent out. We've actually had well over 1,000 individuals actually signing up for the webinar. So we definitely want to give people a chance to join us. And I see people are coming in thick and fast. So very quickly on our panel today, our panel is headed up by our own Managing Director, Benjamin. So Benjamin will be taking you through a presentation in a few minutes. And we feel very fortunate and very privileged to have with us two leaders in their fields. So I'm going to start off with Manoko. Manoko is an organizational psychologist. She is a leader in the professional space, having been a past president of SIOPSA and a current president for the Forum for African Psychology. Very happy to have her with us. And we're also really excited to have Shanaz Parker with us. Shanaz is also an organizational psychologist, and Shanaz comes from the Apex Group, where she's the head of HR for the Middle East and Africa region. So she's going to share with us all of her hands-on experience in talent management. And maybe I should introduce myself as well. I'm Jayendra Naidu, one of the directors at Lumenii. I'm responsible for delivery, also an organizational psychologist by training and profession. Okay, I see we have quite a large number of people that have joined already. Very quickly, our agenda for this morning. We'll have that quick introduction that I've already done. And then we're going to hand over to Benjamin. Benjamin has a presentation prepared for us. He's going to share his insights, both as a leader with hands-on talent management experience, as well as a consultant to some of our clients. And then we're going to move on to our panel discussion. We've received quite a large number of questions from the delegates when the delegates signed on. And we do expect that you will type some questions and comments for us now while we are busy with the presentation and the chat. Please do feel free to comment and to send us through your questions. We will acknowledge those questions, both by responding to them, if not now. We will make sure that we follow up later on with a written response to all questions. But we'd also like to acknowledge them in another way. We'd like to give you a online shopping voucher for the question that our panel and we think are some of the best questions that we do receive, and maybe even for some of the most insightful comments as well. So we're going to allow about 20 minutes for Benjamin to present, and then roughly around 25 minutes for a panel discussion before we wrap up, and we'll try to close at precisely 12 o'clock later today. Okay, so I am going to hand over to Benjamin. Benjamin, over to you.
Thank you, Jayendra. Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's lovely to be online with such a wonderful panel. And thank you all for the signups and for attending our webinar. I must say that I'm always somewhat overwhelmed by the number of people and the wonderful panelists and delegates that we have at these webinars that we do. So thank you so much for coming. I thought maybe a good place to start is with a very small introduction to Lumenii. So, as Jayendra said, I'm the managing director of Lumenii, and what we do at Lumenii is we partner with organizations on talent. So we partner with organizations to help them get the most from their people so that they get the most from their business. And at Lumenii, we're quite fortunate in that we work with a large number of organizations, from very large organizations in South Africa through to SMEs. And this gives us a sort of really nice insight into talent management across the board. And I think lastly, I just would like to mention, what a pleasure it is to work with my co-director, Jayanthan Naidu. Jayanthan, as an IO psychologist, has got more than 23 years of experience. Experience as a psychologist in the military, at an SOE, as well as in various other corporate scenarios. And so what's really nice about having Jayanthan on the panel is that there's, definitely no situation or no question that I've ever seen Jayanthan find too difficult. So please do ask him a tough one or two, especially if you want to get that prize. Okay, so let's get going. So when we put this webinar together, what we thought about is, what do we see as the biggest leadership mistake? What's that one thing that trips us up? And I thought a really interesting way to address this in this forum is to actually share one of our own experiences within Lumenii. So what I've learned in my time in Lumenii, in my time in talent management, is that as people, as human beings, we are subjective. We're built to be subjective. We're biased. We've got our biases, and we're fallible. And the one thing that we are good at is we're good at consistently repeating our mistakes. And when we talk about the biggest leadership mistake, which I'm going to reflect on in a second, it's that time that we decide to promote our best agent or our best, the best person in a team to leadership based on their performance alone. And I thought what I would do is I would actually reflect on a time that I've done this, or that we've done this within Lumenii. And Lumenii is a talent management business. And I think it's very interesting that we've fallen victim to this mistake ourselves. So as we were growing, we decided that we needed to appoint a head of marketing. We had a really great sales team. We sort of looked at the best person in our sales team, and we were implementing our retention strategy, and we wanted to, ensure that we appointed this individual to an important role in the business. So we appointed our best sales agent to our head of marketing. And this was probably one of the biggest mistakes that we made as a business. It cost us an absolute fortune. Having a really great, really high-performing person in the wrong role really locked up that function for about a year. It impacted the whole team. It consumed a lot of my time. Having the wrong person, a great person in the wrong role. And for me, as a business owner and as an entrepreneur, it was really insightful to see the destruction of value that can actually happen directly by having the wrong person in the wrong role. So when we finally resolved it, it was a relief for everybody. It was a relief for the business. It was a relief for me. And what it was a relief for them. It unlocked their career. And also what it did was it unlocked our whole marketing function. So when I look back, I sort of think to myself, if only we'd followed our own advice and we hadn't fallen victim to the Peter Principle. So the Peter Principle is something that we all know. It's something that we're very familiar with, but it's easy to sort of lose sight of it in the moment. So basically what the Peter Principle says, it says that if you make decisions based on past performance alone, what you're going to do is you're going to inevitably appoint somebody to the point of failure. And the reason for this is that past performance alone is not an effective predictor of future performance in a new role. So basically what happens is we get two problems for the price of one. On one hand, we lose our best earner, we lose our best agent, we lose our best operator. And on the other hand, what we do is we bring somebody up into an important leadership position that actually does not have the innate characteristics to make them an excellent leader. And I think as Lumenii, this is probably one of the main issues that we walk into when we're asked to help organizations with talent management, is that we've seen organizations that have grown very rapidly and they've appointed to leadership based on performance within the team. And we sort of asked to help address a scenario where there's a number of people that have been appointed that don't have these innate leadership characteristics. And and we need to sort of help solve this layer of leadership problems. And so the point is, performance is absolutely critical when we're appointing to leadership, but it's not the full picture. So the question is why? Why is it so easy to make these mistakes? And so we've got a model here, which we like to refer to, the iceberg model of behavior. And what we do is, when we observe people, when we see them in a day-to-day scenario, when we interview somebody, what we're really looking at is, we are looking at what you see above the water. What we're experiencing directly is, we're experiencing skill, we're experiencing behavior. And the thing about skill and behavior is that it's not that consistent. It can be based on situation, it can be based on mood, it's subject to bias. It's also subject to impression management, which is, how well is that person trying to manage my impression of them? And so by focusing on what's above the water, what happens is, we tend to make these mistakes. Now, what's nice to know, and what I've learned in my time in this domain, is that there's actually a lot under the water that we can't directly see and we can't directly experience. But what's really nice is that these characteristics and traits that are underneath the water, they support the skill. They're sort of the foundation or the scaffolding for the skill and behavior that's above the water. But what's really interesting and what's really valuable is that these traits and characteristics are well researched, they're consistent, and they are directly measurable. So when we look at agility, for example, what is somebody's ability to deal with change? Another example, cognitive ability, or we look at what drives somebody or their motivations. We know how these elements correlate with performance, and what we know is that we can measure them objectively, and we can measure them accurately, and we can get a good insight into how these elements stably predict performance in a role.
Thank you, Benjamin, for sharing your own personal experiences, and something that I think lots of us are familiar with and have even experienced ourselves, but you're giving us some nice insight into how to actually resolve that very common mistake. We'd like to return to our audience participation again, and we have 2 polls for you this morning. And here's our first poll on the screen right now. This question very simply is, what obstacles do you see preventing organizations from getting the most from objective data? So we're going to give you a number of different options. Please select all of those that you feel are relevant for you as an organization, or what you've witnessed in your experience. So that question again, what obstacles do you see preventing organizations from getting the most from their objective data? And we'll spend about a minute there. We'll give you a chance to give us your responses, and we'll also share the responses with you as they come in, and also share the final result with you after the webinar. Okay. So we are seeing some results, and we see that the reason coming out right at the top, or the obstacle coming up right at the top, is knowledge and understanding. So 59% of respondents saying that that is the major obstacle. And that is followed quite closely by support from leadership. And then budget coming in third, actually, a little bit of a surprise. And the reason that's coming out right at the bottom of that list, also a little bit of a surprise, is priority. So it looks like companies and organizations are prioritizing using objective data.
Thanks, Jensen. I think it's really interesting. I think that, to me, I see a connection between knowledge and support from leadership. I think the two go hand in hand. At the end of the day, my experience has been that it's sometimes not so easy to engage with people that don't really understand the science of psychometric assessments as to how and why they create value. And I think what's really nice is we've got lots of sort of information and material to help that thought process. So maybe what we can do is we can share some of that after this webinar. But so I think this brings us onto data-driven talent management. So what is data-driven talent management and why does it work? So the bottom line is a lot about the underlying psychology of people that is important can be measured. And so when we speak about data-driven talent management, what we do is we are, on one hand, using data to support individual decisions. And I'll get on to what this data is in a second. But by using data to support individual decisions, if we start doing it in general and do that consistently and effectively in an organization, what we're actually doing by deploying data is we're moving the needle on talent, on the talent speedometer, so to speak. And we move that needle from where it is now to overall improving the talent speedometer to high potential. So the question is, why? Why does data support good decisions? So my experience is that, whenever we're making a decision, whether we're conscious of it or not, that element or the criterion that we're using to support our decision has some degree of effectiveness. And it's difficult to see what this degree of effectiveness is on a one-by-one basis when we're making a decision, being that a hiring decision or promotion or succession decision. But what's really great is that we've got access to quite large bodies of industry research, as well as our own research, that brings together large amounts of data and shows us what the relationship is between what we use to make decisions and the ultimate effectiveness of those decisions. And so what I'm going to quote from here is two very well-known pieces of industry research. One is a large research study conducted over 85 years it was a longitudinal study conducted over 85 years. So it looked at, decision criteria that were used to make hiring decisions and how those related to long-term performance. And the second is a meta-analysis of 20 learning agility studies. And so what we see is the things that we tend to focus on, the things that we know, the things that are directly available within a standard talent management process, things like years of education, experience, reference checks, the sorts of things that are generally used within a standard process. What we find is that their relationship with long-term success is actually lower than we expect. So these numbers are performance correlations that are quoted from the studies. And what they show is that the relationship between these items and success is actually below 0.26 correlation. However, when we start to look at some of those elements that are underneath the water, some of these psychological qualities, and we look at how they line up when decisions are made, incorporating them, how they line up with long-term success, what we see much higher and actually quite significant correlations, looking at things like competencies, general mental ability, and learning agility. These ultimately highly correlate with success. And so what this is really telling us is that these psychological measurements of underlying potential really predict the ability to acquire the skill, to acquire the knowledge, and to be able to perform long-term in a role. So I thought what we could do is just briefly look at one or two processes and how data affects them. So this is a traditional recruitment funnel. So talent management process that we see very often is when an organization gets a lot of applicants for a role. And the first step is to screen down an unmanageable number of applicants, be that 20, 50, a few hundred, 1,000. There's got to be some mechanism to work that number of applicants down to a manageable number. And very often what happens is that is screened down using those criteria on the left first. So it means it's quite manual. There's biases come into play, sort of very early on in the process. It's quite laborious. And because of the subjectivity, what we find is that, when we get to the interview stage, we are still dealing with, a number of people that make it through the process that don't have the innate underlying characteristics and traits to line up well with success. So when we deploy data into a process like this, and what we do at Lumenii, as an example, is we actually look at assessing as many people as possible. What we do is we look at first doing online assessments of those yellow bars, of the highly correlating qualities first. And so then what we do is when we look at building a shortlist, that is done using objective data. And so basically at this point, we know that, a significant proportion of people that are in the shortlist have got those underlying traits that line up with long-term success. And so what that means is that when we actually engage with people and we then, conduct the rest of our recruitment process, we're having informed engagements. We're actually engaging with people with the support of that underlying psychological data, and therefore, being sure that we're only choosing the best. And what this does is this really moves that needle of talent to high potential, like I was mentioning earlier. It saves us lots of time, and we really see the quality of talent improve. And the question is, well, what about the Peter principle? There's first set of slides that I started with, and it's exactly the same principle that applies. So if performance alone isn't the thing to look at when looking at promotion and when bringing people into leadership, what do we do? And what we're looking at doing is we're looking at bringing in objective measurements as part of the information, or as part of the puzzle, in terms of deciding who should filter into promotion programs, into succession programs. And we're looking at measuring elements, such as agility, future potential for a role, so that as people are brought into these talent management processes for promotions and succession, we know that we are bringing in people that have got the traits for the future roles that they plan for. And I think the other point is that, that it's very important when using objective data that it's not the be all and end all. The subjective perspective is critically important as well. But what we would say is that it's important to balance both the objective perspective and the subjective perspective, and start with the objective perspective, because that is the highly correlating data.
Thank you, Benjamin. So some really useful practical tips to overcome those mistakes we saw earlier on. Let's go on to our second poll. And the question we are posing to you now is, what strategies does your organization use to drive retention? So please tell us about what's actually happening in your organization right now. Once again, a multi-select poll, so please choose all of those that are relevant for you. And we're going to give you about a minute to respond to this. And really great to see that the chat is so active, and it's the next best thing if we can't actually see our delegates, to actually see the comments and the questions coming through. We'd love to see more questions, so please keep those questions coming through as well. We've already received quite a number of really interesting questions, and I'm going to reverse that challenge that Benjamin threw out a few minutes ago, and I'm going to throw some difficult questions at him in a short while, and maybe Shanaza Monoko might be kind enough to assist. But please do keep those questions coming. I'm sure you want to do some online shopping, and we're very happy to send those vouchers to the best questions. Okay, let's see what the results are saying. So the strategy that's coming out right on the top, there are company values and culture. So organizations focusing on their values and culture, followed by learning and development. And then quite interestingly, the one that's coming right at the bottom is measuring motivation and engagement. So sounds a little bit strange. We want to improve engagement and retention, but actually measuring it is coming out right at the bottom. And perks and incentives also. Surprisingly, not like Benjamin said, we can't just throw money at a potential problem. Thank you very much for the responses. Yes, sorry, over to you, Benjamin.
Yeah, no, great. I think it's very, very interesting. For me, makes me wonder, I see that measuring culture was right up there, and I think there's a lot of familiarity with the fact that culture is measurable. But I wonder whether the same level of familiarity is there about the fact that, measuring or incorporating what drives somebody and what energizes them is equally possible within, within a selection context. So I think this is one of the big questions that we get is, what do we do to foster retention? How do we, what steps can we take to ensure that we don't lose our top talent and make sure that these people that, are really critical to the progress in our organization stay? And I think that the thing that I've learned here about retention is that there is no silver bullet. There is no one single thing that solves retention problems. Retention is very much a multifaceted puzzle. So there's a number of different things to consider when looking at retention. But the first thing for me is to recognize that, it's people. People spend a significant portion of their lives at work, be it 8, 10, 12, or even more hours a day. And so it's very important that, and what we see as one of the main drivers is that it's very important that what people as human beings want lines up with what they are able to experience and what they're able to get during this time, that they're so much time that they're devoting to their working day. And that starts with, on one hand, do they really get the job? Do they really get what it is that they need to be doing? And then secondly is, do they want to be there? Do they want to be doing this job? And then I think the third point is, do they have the ability? Do they have the time? Do they have the skill to do that job? But I think, when we talk about motivation, and for me, it's interesting to see that it came up lowest on the survey. And I think that's one of the very important things to look at is, does the role actually offer what I'm looking for in my experience as a human being? And it's wrong to think that money is enough of a motivator. When we look at motivators, when we look at what lines up with what people want, we actually look at 20 different things. And, for example, some people are looking for success, some people are looking for responsibility, some people are looking for creativity, some are looking for independence. And it's really important to understand what those intrinsic needs are as part of the process, and line up and line up as much as possible between what the role offers and what somebody's actually looking for that large amount of time that they're spending in that role. And I think the second point is, when it comes to retention, it's a bit self-evident, but retention is a more effective strategy than hiring. And so how do we go about implementing a retention strategy? It comes down to taking a long-term view right from the point that we hire. So when we're hiring somebody, we're actually hiring them to retain them. We're not only looking at what is their potential and what is the ability to be successful in the role now, but we've also got to consider what's their ability to be successful and to remain interested and align with what the organization offers, and what's the ability to progress through the organization. And for example, a very key element there is looking at what their agility is and how they line up with the company DNA. And then once somebody is part of the organization, what sorts of opportunities, and it was really great to see that learning and development came up so high in the poll. But, what opportunities can we offer them that are in line with their ambitions in order to grow? And that very much drives retention in the organization. And I would say that's very much the basis for succession planning. But I think that's the subject of another webinar. So I think that's pretty much the end of my presentation. What we're going to do as part of the resource pack is we're going to share a few links to a few success stories of particular cases where organizations have implemented data-driven talent management. And these are on the screen here. That'll be part of the resource pack, which Jensen will share with you in the end. But I think, based on that, Jensen, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. I see some very interesting questions coming through and comments coming through, which we'll pick up on in the discussion. And I'm sure everyone is itching to hear from our experts, Shanaz and Noko. So without wasting any further time, let's jump into it. But let's maybe first give our esteemed guests an opportunity to introduce themselves briefly and maybe tell us a little bit about your main focus at the moment in your practice. Okay, shall we start with Monoko?
All right, thanks. I was waiting for Q to start. Thank you very much, Jonathan and Benjamin. I thank you for the opportunity to share on this platform and in this webinar today. I think you already introduced us. I'm an IO psychologist in private practice, get to associate with a number of fabulous entities, I think doing what I love most, which is helping companies bring out the best potential in their people. And I do that in many ways. What I'm currently busy with, and I find I spend my time on, besides leadership development and besides coaching and executive coaching in particular, is the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, which is not only a buzzword, but it's a necessity in terms of how we unlock potential in people. So that's what I'm busy with at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Noko. Shanaz?
Hi, everyone. As previously introduced, I'm the regional head of HR for Apex for the MEA region. Our organization, Maitland, was recently acquired. So my current focus at the moment is to ensure that we are integrating our organization across the South Africa region, and then, of course, into the broader group. So my focus is largely about settling structures across the entity, learning the new regions and the portfolio, and settling on cultures for people so that ease of integration is experienced. It's not easy or simple, but we show up every day to try. So the question, I think, Jane Ethren, is rather what am I not busy with rather than what am I focusing on?
Thank you, Shanaz. I think while you're in the spotlight, let's just pose the first question to you. Okay, so I know previously your focus was on finding the best talent, and you did such a great job that I know your competitors even poach your interns and so on. But one of the questions that came through from our delegates is, what are the critical factors you consider in the employee selection process to ensure you hire the right talent for your organization? And I know Benjamin's already touched upon this, but I think it would be really valuable to hear from somebody that's actually currently hands-on doing it or used to be doing it quite actively.
Well, I don't personally do it so much anymore. Rather have other people in the team that do manage this, but we have processes and structures that we manage accordingly. I find, in terms of what the most critical factors in selecting good caliber candidates is one that encompasses a variety of processes in your selection process, or a variety of factors in your process. It is not a one-size-fits-all bucket. You have to understand different roles require different things. And so it's a combination of factors for me. Cognitive abilities most definitely helps. So all of that structures that Benjamin has previously alluded to. But what I'm finding very, very interestingly in having used your assessment tools recently, and very specifically for a particular cohort of candidates, is the learning agility is a very good predictor for us in terms of how successful someone can be. And that's specifically because when you experience day-to-day in our world of really a lot of uncertainty, a lot of change continually thrown at people, you need to have a level of agility where people can learn and figure things out with a certain set of tools that you give them, but that inherent learning agility helps push them ahead to actually do that. So in summary of what I would consider critical success factors: cognitive abilities, learning agility assessment, understanding of education. Yes, all of those things are important and preferences are all important, but for me, that learning agility is a key factor.
Great, thank you very much, Shanaz. It sounds like you are putting into practice what the research is saying, and it sounds like the ability to deal with the unknown and new experiences is coming to the forefront as the most important predictor. Thank you very much. A question that's quite closely related that we get quite often and has come through once again for this webinar is about the selection of senior management and the most senior roles. And I think I'm going to hand this one over to Benjamin. So Benjamin, can you tell us a little bit about what you think is the most effective recruitment strategy for hiring in senior roles?
I think it's very much in line with what Shanaz was just mentioning. I think that comprehensive perspective is definitely the way to go. So when we look for hiring to senior positions, we look at things like, does the is there alignment with the competencies for the role? So what's actually needed from the role, and how well does the individual's competencies align with the requirements of the role? But all of the perspectives are critical. So looking at cognitive ability as well, and then based on what we see and what the research says, measuring learning agility is absolutely critical. I find it rare these days to find senior appointments that are done without actually measuring learning agility. And the reason for this is, more and more seniors have to encounter new experiences, and somebody with higher learning agility is equipped to let go of old ways of doing things and engage with new ways of doing things. And the world's very much about new. Things are changing, strategies are changing, technologies are changing, and so this ability to learn from new experiences is really what sets very high potential seniors, sets them apart, basically. So I would say it's the combination, and agility is absolutely critical.
Great, thank you very much. And if I can just throw in my 2 cents worth, I think hiring a senior individual is different from hiring maybe an entry-level type of individual, because when you invite a senior individual into the organization, that individual is going to help to shape that organization. So I think we need to be really careful that we select not just for the skills, but also for the type of individual that we know is going to drive and shape the organization in a way that we want, and is going to drive our mission and our strategy as well. Okay. So yes, Shanaz, please.
Jay, if I may just weigh in sort of something to support that as well. What I often see, and the conversations I tend to have, is where line managers, at whichever level, but sometimes mostly at the senior levels, right? They want to appoint people that they like and that people that they get on with. That is not a good success factor. All that does is, for your organization, is perpetuate a stereotype of the Peter Principle, number one. It perpetuates problems that you will experience in terms of your culture. And so managers often would come and say, but I'm appointing the person for the right attitude. No, it's not about the right attitude. It's because you actually like the person and you get on with the person. And while that's key for an employee and line manager relationship, I think the combination of a variety aspects to selection is what is critical.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shanaz. We actually see that happening so often in practice. And I think one of the ways that we can alleviate that is not to place a candidate before a line manager until you have the objective data about how well the person fits the role. So we know that we're eliminating that risk of not having the right skills for the job, but having the right attitude, as the manager puts it.
Can I chip in really quickly 1 second?
Sure,
I just think it's such a wonderful point. And, we've actually seen how this can affect an organization strategically. And there's a really great example, and we should add it maybe to the resource pack, about how this behavior of appointing people we like and similar people was really impinging on the Rabobank's strategy, a very large European bank, second largest bank in the Netherlands. And what they found was that by the history of appointing people that were too similar to themselves, the senior leadership constrained their vision and they weren't able to meet their strategic objectives. And so what they did was they started using objective measurements, specifically agility, to ensure that they were appointing high potential people, but far more diverse and far more inclusive. And with that, they were really able to deliver on their strategy as a bank. And I think that was very, very exciting and very interesting. But I won't steal any more time on it, but I just wanted to mention that great outcome.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. So diversity and inclusion certainly on everyone's minds. And I think something else that you touched upon was retention, definitely on everybody's minds, question that we get asked a lot. So I want to move on to a question that somebody sent to us about retention. And the question is, with the new way of doing things with hybrid and remote work, how do you make sure that talent is retained, as now employees are looking for flexibility and well-being as key benefits? So I think I would really like to hear from Monoko being really involved in that space of coaching and maybe even wellness.
Thank you, Jay, for that question. And I think I want to give a little bit of context, to it. And I think this is my lived experience. This is what I get to see as I consult in various organizations. The reality of where we sit right now is that all of us coming out of COVID, we talk about BC and it now means before COVID. We talk about mid-pandemic, that's kind of like the language as we describe, the journeys that our various organizations have been through. Coming out of that, I find that a lot of individuals at an individual level, at an employee level, teams within an organization, at an organizational level, we are somewhat in a survivalist mode. Organizations are trying to rebuild, from the losses that came out of COVID, the ensuing, socioeconomic downturn. And I think it's a global phenomenon or a global narrative. So mentally, or the mindset is currently more on how do we survive? How do we regain market share? How do we rebuild? And in all of that frenzy, we're missing out on actually, building that culture and the values of where the organization and how the organization wants to show up in the market. And in missing that, we are missing literally the basics and the building blocks for creating an environment where employees can feel engaged, employees can have a sense of meaning, employees feel valued, and therefore, we can retain them. And I think I've seen in the chats as well, people sharing that it's not about money anymore. That's completely out of the conversation. What we are shying away from is having the difficult conversations. And the difficult conversations around how do we co-create in a new emerging future. And what frustrates a lot of HR professionals is that there's no theory for this. No one has come up with a framework about how to navigate, the new hybrid working environment. I was in a workshop yesterday where we were facilitating a difficult conversation for parents in a hybrid environment. One was saying, well, I want to still be able to go and pick up and drop off my children. And one of the employees, colleagues, was saying in the same meeting, well, I've arranged transport for that, so I don't need, to do that. And therefore, that is the reason why I want to be in the office every day. I want to work from here. Somebody was saying, you guys have the pleasure of doing all of that. I don't have a choice but to come in and work in the office. It's a difficult conversation. There's no theory, there's no framework that says, if this is the situation, this is what you do it. And what we're saying is that we need to be looking more at co-creating the spaces we want to work in. If you say it's a hybrid, how do we ensure that there's a sense of belonging that comes with it? And one of the ways that I do facilitate such conversations is to use Theory U by Otto Scharmer, which is a new way of thinking, really. It says, don't look at what's been done before, because where we are right now, no one has been there. And it uses a 5-step process that requires you to have an open mind, open heart, open will, and literally creatively get into a space where you co-create something new that works for an organization. I think we are sitting at the cusp of really new ways of working that ask for all of us that are sitting in this room as HR professionals is we need to allow ourselves to bring that creativity forth. It's not going to come from anywhere. We are in the situation and we need to solve for it. So I know it's probably a lot to say. What I'm really, emphasizing here is that we are given an opportunity now to define what our organizations should look like, or to define what proper engagement, would look like. And it's a tall ask. We're talking here about using objective data, using the science, using our lived experiences to co-create that. But it's I don't know, I'm excited about it. I think it's an exciting challenge. It calls for us to do things we've never done before and to rewrite, the world of work to make it much more meaningful for everyone.
Great. Thank you very much, Minoko. I think you're also touching upon, the psychological factors and impact there as well. And we had a number of questions concerning what are the psychological factors that influence employee retention. I saw a number of comments, about the relevance of Maslow, whether you can retain people merely by paying them. And maybe just to round up that discussion, I do agree that we do need our basic needs met. So you're not going to retain someone if you don't acknowledge and satisfy their basic needs. But Maslow talks about self-realization being at the pinnacle of retention, or we can consider it the pinnacle of retention. And what I'm hearing from you, Minoko, is that self-realization is not the same for everyone. It means something different for different people, and we need to listen to what people are saying they want from the workplace. And as Benjamin indicated earlier, retention is multifaceted. And I think this is pointing to the fact that retention actually starts with selection. So you need to ask us questions at the selection phase. What do you want from the work environment? Benjamin mentioned a few of those factors that we can think about, such as success, cooperation, or structure in the work environment. And we need to pay attention to what the individual is asking for. So I think in summary, there is no simple answer about what are the most important psychological factors. Like you said, we need to co-create, we need to listen to people, exercise a little bit of empathy. I see someone's talking about empathy on the chat as well. All of that for me is pointing to organizational culture. And this has come up previously in the discussion. We had a very specific question about culture. And the question was, does organizational culture determine talent retention? And how does an organization develop a culture, and can it be revised like we do with policies? So can we wake up one morning and decide that we need to change our culture? Shanaz, how do you feel about this?
So that's a really interesting question, because does culture, where does it stem from, right? So you can have an organizational culture, you can have subcultures within an organization, and it all comes from the people that we put in those senior roles that help to drive not only how people are managed and dealt with in an organization, but also whose agenda are we actually driving? Is it a personal agenda? Is it a group agenda? So culture is a misnomer, and often, in most of my organizations that I've worked in, it boils down to, HR has to help us with culture. No, we can help you with some guiding principles, but actually it's about your behavior. I would consider policies being exactly the same thing, right? I can put a policy in place, and I can put policies to kill you to death on how to do things, right? But all that it's a structure and a framework, which at the bottom line, culture is all about behavior. So if you think about your behavior is what driving the culture, and not HR behavior, everyone's behavior, right? And that way and being is what actually drives your culture. For example, I can state in a policy that we have to have diversity and inclusive practices. But if your managers and and senior leaders are not practicing inclusivity through a simple thing like including somebody that should be included in a meeting, you're not going to live inclusivity, right? So then does the policy help? Not really, because your behaviors have got to be what drives the culture.
Yep, exactly. Agree with you 100%. And very interestingly, the way the question was phrased, it makes it sound like, we need to make a conscious effort to develop a culture. But an organization will have a culture even if they try to, or whether they're measuring it or not. There was a comment earlier about an organization that has a very high staff turnover, and they feel that they're okay with it, and they're not really going to focus on it. So they're not really bothered about retention. So that is their culture. Their culture is one of maybe not paying attention to people's needs and knowing that people aren't going to spend too much time with them. And I really just want to emphasize what you say, the culture is determined by leadership behavior. So those of us in leadership positions, we need to be very cognizant of that. A really interesting discussion. We had so many questions. I just want to shift the focus a little bit in a slightly different direction before we run out of time. And I think the one question that I want to ask is around leadership and succession, making sure you have a good pipeline in place. And the question is, how can organizations use data and analytics to identify skill gaps and prioritize employee development initiatives? So once again, we're talking about individual development. So I'm going to direct this one again towards you, Monoko.
Yeah, sure. I think data. I've been working for a long time, and I remember a time we used to talk about garbage in, garbage out. And I want to talk that in the context of that pyramid of knowledge or the data pyramid. It's got many names and many variations. To say, one of the things that we don't do very well is to look at the source of our data, and that's right at the bottom of the pyramid. South Africa, particularly in our context, and I'm sure in many other companies, because I know there are people logging in here from different countries. There are legislative requirements in terms of data that HR people or HR professionals are mandated to keep. What is the quality of that data? Are you getting the right data, and how are you using it? And if you go further up, that pyramid, you collect the data and you need to turn it into information. And we do that on a weekly, monthly basis through our reporting processes. Again, what is, the end goal for that information that we are then making out? The next step of the pyramid is that the information should turn into knowledge. What do we know? What do we understand? What does that data, that initial data and that information translate to in terms of the various dynamics that are emerging in our organizations for our people? And it doesn't end there. For you to be able to make great decisions in terms of your culture of your organization, your people, practices, from an HR perspective, that data should eventually translate into intelligence or wisdom, as people say. In that way, you are able to then make the right decisions around your data analytics. So there's many products in the market in terms of how to collect and how to manage data. I think the biggest challenge that I find, is that we're still struggling with that transactional HR functionality that a lot of us are operating in, and we're taking a longer time to step into the strategic kind of outputs from an HR perspective. And if we think about that gap and how we want to bridge that gap, for me, data should then translate into wisdom that enables you as an HR professional to advise the organization from a strategic perspective and to make decisions that enable you to retain your talent or to even search for talent. So there's a lot of information that I think all of us in this room are sitting with. How do we translate it into intelligence, and how do we translate it into the wisdom that we require to make the right strategic decisions? And I think the answer in that is, I think, let's get out of the survivalist mode. Let's start co-creating the future that we want to work in.
Thank you very much, Monoko. We are very quickly running out of time, but there was a very interesting question posed by Prashanthi, which I think I would like to direct towards Benjamin. And this has to do with the data approach. And Prashanthi says, this might be a stupid question, but the data-driven approach used by Lumenii and a lot of other companies seem to be more focused on skilled workers. And she says this might be a false assumption. But how can we use a data-driven approach, or what would a data approach look like for blue-collar employees, for example? So while our focus was on leadership in this webinar, how does it apply to blue-collar workers?
It's a very, very good question, and it's something that we've actually got quite a lot of experience practically with. But the bottom line is that when we look at a data-driven approach, what we're doing is we're looking at measuring underlying psychological data. And the underlying psychological data, it relates to people and not to jobs. What we do is we relate the data to a job in particular, but it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what level of work you're doing, it doesn't matter which country you're from. At the end of the day, we've all got underlying personalities, we've got underlying drives. And so what we're doing is we are underlying cognitive ability, and that's independent of level of education, it's independent of role, it's independent of blue or white collar. And so what we do is we first start by looking at the underlying psychological perspectives. And just as Monoko said, it's very important to get a clear perspective that I really like that garbage in, garbage out comment, Monoko. So starting with good data about, what makes up and what drives an individual. It doesn't matter if what job they're doing. We can then use that data to make inferences about how they're going to perform, in the particular role that we need. So data is agnostic to the role. It just depends on how we use it in making decisions.
Great. Thank you very much, Benjamin. We have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to pose one quick question to all of our panelists. Okay, so we're talking about talent, we're talking about HR, and I think very often leaders are going to see themselves as separate from that HR function if they're not specifically an HR leader. But what would you say is the responsibility and the role of leaders in the organization in selection and retention? Okay, can we start with Shanaz?
So I think they have a very critical and key role to begin with, right? It all starts with, and depending on where you consider leaders to be, because in a system or an organization, everyone can be a leader within their own right. When your question, I'm going to infer that you're talking about leadership within a hierarchical structure, right? So if we look at that, I think it's about leaders being able to set that tone from the top, so that, and being the example to that, and actually do what they say they're going to do. That's so critical. So as a leadership team, the coherence is so critical. In other words, a leadership team has to move together as one, whether we have differing opinions about something or not. And that then distills to the rest of the organization a way of being. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's the leader. I think that's the role I think leaders play.
Thank you very much. We are very short in time. Monoko, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
I'll give a quick one. There's a book that came out in 2019. It's called The Fifth Revolution by Emmanuel Joseph, PhD. And he says, and I love the point that Shanaz brings up about everyone being a leader. But what they were saying 2019, pre-COVID, was that in the fifth industrial revolution, as I would call it, it's all about being human. It's all about creating happiness in the workplace. And I'm seeing a lot of organizations, vision and mission, talking about happiness for everyone. It's all about creating health, engagement, compassion, inclusivity, creativity, digitally enabled progress and profit. So leaders should really be looking at those things to ensure that we turn the corner.
Thank you very much, Monoko. I love Shamima's comment. Shamima is saying, you don't need a title to be a leader. Everyone in the organization can be a leader by example. Benjamin, in final words from yourself?
Yeah, I think, where we see very effective progress is where leaders are willing to, lead by example. When a new process comes in, when they're willing to be first, when they're willing to be open, and when they're willing to be vulnerable and human, even if it means, taking risks, being open as leaders and being vulnerable and human, it really sets that tone and brings people along. Rather, do it with rather than do it to is very effective.
Thank you very much. 1 hour really has just flown by, and unfortunately, that is the end of our time together. A huge thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for your wonderful insights, for sharing your experience and your knowledge with our delegates. Like Benjamin indicated, we will be sharing those resources with you. We have a number of resources that we can share with you. And there were a number of questions about the recording. The recording will definitely be shared with all of the attendees, as well as people that couldn't make it to the session today. So the resources we're going to be sharing with you, we have a competency library that you're very welcome to access and use. We have a number of case studies that illustrate the best use case. And we're going to offer you also an opportunity to assess your own agility. So that is open for everyone that has attended. And if you'd like to speak to one of us, please, by all means, we'd love to hear your stories, your experiences. And like Monoko says, we'd love to help you co-create as well. Thank you very much, everyone. We look forward to seeing you very soon in our next webinar.